Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started just momentarily. Just want to give a minute or two for people to load into the webinar. It takes about 2 minutes for 300 people to load in, so if you'll just be patient with us, we will get started momentarily. Good morning. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all well and staying safe wherever you are. This is our 15th webinar since restrictions on meeting in person went into place in March. And even though you can't see everyone's faces, you should know that by taking part in these sessions, you're part of a global community interested in trade with over 4,000 participants on Zoom in these 15 sessions from over 74 countries and 36 US states. I'm going to start a new tradition today. I'm going to call out 3 or 4 names of attendees just to give you a sense of who's attending these sessions, even if you can't see each other's faces. Welcome today to Diane Sullivan with ACLI. Ambassador John Weeks, Canada's ambassador to the GATT during the Uruguay round, is here. Peter Allgaier, former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and Jill O'Donnell at the WITA Institute at the University of Nebraska. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to everybody on today's session. It's our plan to keep providing these online sessions even after restrictions are lifted so that we can continue to reach a larger national and global audience. We hope you'll join us next Thursday, June 18th, as we examine the rapid increase in the use of digital tools like Zoom to conduct business during the pandemic. And we'll discuss then the nexus to that with the trade initiatives that could both enable or harm their continued use. We have an all-star panel next week featuring Ambassador Francis Lisson, Australia's permanent representative to the WTO, Javier Lopez of the OECD, Jake Colvin from the Global Innovation Forum, and Wendy Cutler from the Asia Society Policy Institute, who will be coming back to our sessions. In the following week, we have a special presentation of the Back to Normal Barometer, which measures American attitudes towards reopening society and has major implications for workers, businesses, and trade. For this week, if you're watching on Zoom, after discussion amongst our panelists, we'll ask that you use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And if you registered for today's event on Zoom, you should have received an email this morning with biographies of all our panelists and today's event program. For today, we're delighted to welcome Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America, Anthony Phillipson, back to WITA. Anthony is an old friend of many of us from his days in Washington back in the early 2000s and his time working for the British Prime Minister. And Anthony, I don't think we ever discussed that you and I both studied modern history at university. We'll have to share some stories over a beer about the nexus of trade, history and trade, and how we both landed where we did today. He'll be joined today by his countryman, Craig Beaumont, the Director of External Affairs of the UK Federation of Small Businesses, and 2 dear friends of mine, Laura Lane and Tim Keeler, both of whom I've known for over 20 years and share many of the same scars from trade wars in DC going back to back to the 1990s. Hopefully a trade agreement between the US and UK is more of a coronation than a war, if I could mix my metaphors. So with that, thank you and welcome to Anthony, Craig, Tim, and Laura. Tim, take it away.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you for all the great participants that we have today. I'm going to give a quick introduction of our panelists and really want to get right into the meat of it to talk about US-UK. I will note this is a very big day. For me personally, it's the first day in 3 months that I put on a button down and a jacket. That's how much I care about WITA and look forward to today's discussion. Up first will be Anthony Phillipson, who, as mentioned, is the British Consul General in New York and Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America. He's a longtime civil servant, joining the civil service in 1993. As Ken mentioned, he has held a variety of incredibly important roles, including Prime Minister's Private Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Back in the days when I was at USTR, we would occasionally be in meetings to talk about the Doha negotiations. Let's, again, hope that the US-UK discussions go much more productively than those that end up going. But he's also been the High Commissioner to Singapore and the Director of Trade and Partnerships in the Department for Exiting the European Union. We're also pleased to have Laura Lane, who I'm sure everyone in WITA knows quite well, the very dynamic president of global public affairs for UPS. She's had a long, distinguished career, not only in the private sector, but really an incredible career in the government, both at USTR and in the Foreign Service at the State Department, with some really amazing stories and background, particularly from Rwanda. And finally, we have Craig Beaumont, who is, as mentioned, with the Director of External Affairs and Advocacy for the UK Federation for Small Businesses. Really is fantastic perspective to have for WITA from across the Atlantic. He is the SB senior staffer who leads their policy, public affairs, international, EU, and media teams. He's also got a fascinating background, including working on the London 2012 organizing committee of the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Anthony to give thoughts from the government on US-UK trade and trade negotiations, and we'll get going. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to join you this morning, and thanks very much for the opportunity. As you say, let me just say a few words about where we are on the FTA. I'm very happy to dig into questions on other issues, but let me focus on the FTA because it's top of the list for us just at the minute. I mean, negotiating an FTA between the UK and US is something that has been a priority for the UK government for quite a long time, actually, certainly since 23rd of June 2016, when the referendum led to our beginning the process of leaving the EU. We were always very conscious that we couldn't start negotiating until we had left, but we began some pretty intensive preparation work with our US colleagues through something called the Trade and Investment Working Group, which ended up meeting 6 times after its inaugural meeting in July 2017. I was actually there in my previous role that was mentioned when I was in the Department for Exiting the EU. And we used that process to work very closely with our USTR, but also colleagues across the US agencies and administration, just to really understand what are the key building blocks of an FTA. We also studied things like USMCA, talked a lot to others who had negotiated with our US colleagues, including Canadian colleagues, in order to get ready to make a really fast start on the negotiation when we could get there. I'll be honest, we had hoped to begin the negotiation in April 2019, when originally we were meant to leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019. And indeed, I think USTR published their negotiating objectives in February last year in anticipation of that. But then obviously we got a bit held up as the moment of leaving the EU slipped off to the right a bit. But 31st of January this year, we left the EU, which I think actually is a hugely significant moment in terms of allowing us to begin this process. We published our negotiating objectives in early March, and I think we were gearing up to begin a negotiation at the end of that month if we hadn't been disrupted by the COVID pandemic. But 5th of May, Ambassador Lighthizer, Secretary of State for International Trade Liz Truss, met virtually, and they launched the first round of this negotiation. That led immediately into a plenary session between the 2 chief negotiators, Oliver Griffiths on our side, Dan Mullaney on the US side, with their full negotiating teams, and then 10 days of pretty intensive talks through all the chapters that we want to cover in what we aim to conclude as a comprehensive agreement. This is not a normal negotiation in many ways. We are not able to meet in person, so that round was conducted virtually. The next round that kicks off on the 15th of June for about 2 weeks after that will also be conducted virtually. The other reason is that we talk about rounds in a sort of traditional sense, but we are using the time in between the rounds to work intensively, again with US colleagues, through all the key aspects of the chapter to see how much progress we can make as fast as we can make it. Because coming back to the sense of political will, certainly very strong, I think, on both sides. But we have also worked very closely with key members of Congress to explain to them what our ambitions are. And we've also, something I might come back to in a minute, made a real effort to sort of spread our message out across the United States at state level, because we want to prepare for the moment, which we hope will be soon and much quicker than people probably would normally do a trade negotiation, when we will want to be beginning a process of trying to get a trade agreement through Congress on the US side and indeed through Parliament on the UK side. And as I say, it's hard to overstate the priority for both governments, I think, and hard to overstate how keen we are to do this in a very different way and a much quicker way than would normally be done. I mentioned that our ambition is to conduct a comprehensive negotiation. We published a written statement to Parliament after the first round that set out around 30 chapters that we would aim to be covering. I'm going to come back to one key one at the end of my remarks, focusing on SMEs. But if you look at those chapters, they are traditional chapters of an FTA, but there's also, I think, a very strong focus throughout it on creating a forward-leaning and a future-proofed relationship between the UK and US. So we want to make sure that we take the opportunity to really build really strong links in digital trade, IP protection, data issues. These are going to be the key drivers, in our view, of the future of the global economy. UK and US, I think, already have very high standards in these areas, but there's a real opportunity for us to take that to even greater heights and then roll that discussion into plurilateral and global fora and try and set the standards for the future of the global economy. That sounds quite ambitious, but I think that's what we're trying to do. We're not starting from scratch in terms of the relationship, and I won't rehearse all of the figures, but we state often that the US is our single biggest export market. We are the third biggest export market for the US. We are the biggest investors in each other's country. 2018, almost $1 trillion invested in both countries in total. One stat that we use a lot, because I think it illustrates the level of engagement already and the importance of that investment, is that each day 1.3 million people go to work for British companies in the US and 1.7 million go to work for US companies in the UK. And I think that just is testament to the strength and depth of the relationship. In 33 states across the United States, we are in the top 5 export markets. There is investment in every single state in the US creating jobs here in the US. Our assessment, and sometimes people feel that this doesn't feel like that big a figure, our assessment is that an ambitious FTA can increase trade between the two of us by $20 billion in the long run. People say, why isn't it bigger? I think it's in part because we've already got a very deep relationship, as I mentioned. But also, I would just say that's not an insignificant figure. And I also don't think it captures the gains that can be had of creating higher quality, better paid jobs that rest on exports to each other's country. And as I say, creating the platform through which we can have that global discussion. Let me just finish with a word on SMEs, if I may, not just because Craig is on the line. This has always been a priority for us. Alongside the Trade and Investment Working Group, we created something called an SME dialogue, again, set up between ourselves, colleagues in USTR and the Commerce Department, but also with a very strong industry voice in it. SMEs are frankly the lifeblood of both of our economies. They are hugely important in terms of creating jobs and opportunity in our local communities. 87% of companies that export to the US from the UK are SMEs. 81% of companies that export to the UK from the US are SMEs. And I would also just say that they're the ones who probably stand to gain most if we can address some of the remaining trade barriers, some of the remaining tariffs between us. And as I say, if we can future-proof the relationship in those areas around digital trade and IP protection. So we want to keep that dialogue going. There will be a dedicated SME chapter in the FTA. And just to start where I finished, finish where I started, forgive me. And I hope no one can hear it, but someone started drilling in the apartment above me now that we've reopened New York to construction workers. We want to do this very, very fast. If possible, we want to try and get an agreement signed before the election. And that is a shared ambition between the two governments. Some people say to me often, well, surely you can't, it's too quick. To which my answer would be, well, the only way to guarantee that we won't is if we never start and if we don't try. So I think we're running at this very, very fast in full partnership with our US colleagues. That is not to say there aren't difficult issues between us and they get replayed in the press quite often. But at the minute, we are focused on seeing where there are areas of commonality, seeing how fast we can move this negotiation into exchange of texts. The next round, I think, will be hugely significant in terms of seeing where we are. And we want to make sure that it's properly infused with a sense of business priorities. Because at the end of the day, although we talk a lot about the jobs that we create, I would say, only maybe for the British government on this one, we don't create jobs, business creates jobs. So our job is to help business do more business, and that's what this is all about. So thank you very much. Very happy to take questions, comments, and all of that, or indeed anything else I haven't mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Never thought I'd hear myself say the words, I'm delighted to hear the sound of construction, just as a sign of the country and the economy coming back. So that was actually welcome. Laura, let me turn it over to you and to give a viewpoint from yourself and some priorities for UPS.
Okay. Just to begin, our 495,000 UPSers operating in the 220 countries and territories around the world really felt a special responsibility throughout COVID-19. I will share with you that sometimes people spend a lifetime, wondering whether they've ever made a difference in the world, and UPSers to a person had incredible courage and determination, and showed up to work every single day because we didn't want to let any of you down. We knew how our country, how the United Kingdom, how the world was counting on us to deliver essential supplies, to be able to deliver what was needed so everybody could abide by those stay-at-home orders. And we took it personal, and we promised that we would deliver. And I will share with you, now that we're coming out of COVID-19, UPSers take that very same responsibility in terms of figuring out how we're going to drive economic recovery. I will tell you that we saw firsthand the impact of this crisis because we were involved in so many different supply chains that had been disrupted. Food supply chains, we saw, the elderly in need of being delivered their medicines and foods, and the kids being delivered, food if they depended on schools to be their source of meals. We saw so many things in terms of small and medium-sized companies that were going under because they couldn't have their storefronts open. And we did everything we could to think about ways to keep everybody going through the crisis, particularly the small and medium-sized businesses. And that all for us is why trade is so essential, and why this UK-US agreement is going to be so consequential for part of the economic recovery efforts. We have to figure out ways to get all economies moving again. And from that perspective, the UK has always been such an incredibly trade liberalizing and forward-looking, partner in the trade negotiation, arena. And we really want to see this UK-US agreement really set the standards for what economic recovery can be and what progress going forward should be. And so from that perspective, when we look at this agreement, in the past, we would always see job creation from every single agreement that was negotiated. We always saw an increase in volume of up to 20%, just because of the new opportunities that were created. But in COVID-19, we saw the power of digital trade, the ways in which we helped a lot of our customers get back on their feet, which has just started in certain parts of the world, but also begin that recovery effort, has been through the power of e-commerce. And so first and foremost, I would say what we're looking out of at the UK-US agreement is opportunities to make trade more inclusive. When we look at who was hardest hit in this pandemic, it was those that were sometimes left behind. We've got to figure out ways to write trade agreements that are more inclusive, that bring everybody all in and realizing those benefits. And so that means helping some of the hardest hit in this pandemic, i.e. many of the women. Look at the demographics. Women are going to be some of the hardest hit coming through this economic recovery. I know the UK and the US can write an agreement that really addresses some of the biases that have been unintentionally included in trade agreements that I think can build on what was done in the USMCA. I think we need to make it more inclusive, and I know that the UK and the US can do this by creating those opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses. Here again, the US-Mexico agreement set a really valuable standard in terms of how to get small and medium-sized business barriers knocked down. And I would also argue the opportunity to be able to bring in some of those new e-commerce and digital trade provisions. The UK economy, like the US economy, is really strong in the area of services. If we can set the bar a little bit higher about what great looks like for services and digital trade, I think we will be doing the global community a great service by shaping the landscape in terms of how to make trade more inclusive, how to raise the standards for liberalization, and really bring more of the benefits to the global community. Finally, I'll say, in an economic recovery mode, obviously we've seen a lot of governments do everything that they can to be able to help businesses regain their footing, but some of it has meant that governments have taken economic stakes in some of those businesses. We have to ensure that we work towards a level playing field and not have government subsidies that have been provided distort competition in the marketplace. We have to make sure that state-owned and state-sponsored entities don't have unfair advantages in competing. And I think the place to start is in a UK-US agreement, because I think both of our governments have that interest at heart. We want to see businesses grow, not government stakes in businesses grow. And so this agreement, I think, represents a really big opportunity to help post-COVID-19 with economic recovery, making trade more inclusive and leveling playing fields to set standards for other countries to model going forward. So I'll turn it back to you, Tim, and be happy to answer any of the questions in more detail about ways that we can help small businesses, because I know Craig's going to touch on it, and UPS has got a lot of ideas there.
Thanks, Laura. Exactly. Yeah, let's turn it over to Craig to hear the perspective of UK small businesses.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, Laura, Tim and Ken. Really interesting thoughts. And thanks also to the UK Department for Trade, the British Embassy, for inviting me to join the panel today. I hope one day we'll be able to visit Washington in person and talk face to face. Just very quickly about FSB and who we are. We're the UK's largest business group by some way, with 165,000 members. All of them are individuals, so it's the business owner that's the member, not the business. So we're not a corporate association. It's that individual at the center of the small business. And that means the relationship with us is very personal and it's very grassrootsy, but at the same time, we are trying to convert that into positive policy development, and trade's the obvious place for that. In the US, we don't really have a clear counterpart. So I'd say we're a mix of some of the private sector trade groups you've got on this call, the US Chamber of Commerce, for example, but also a little bit of what the SBA does as well. And we've hosted a couple of the SBA administrators over here in the UK, such as Karen Mills, and we maintain our relationships with those, so we kind of spark off on policy. Now, we are absolutely passionate about the opportunities presented by trade to small businesses. Our mission is to help small businesses achieve their ambitions, and we want small firms to raise their sights and consider going global. Now, ideally, this should be at the outset of a small business owner's journey as they start up. So it's not something to consider later on. It's something for every small business to consider how they go about it. But we don't think anyone should wait for that. And as Laura says, this isn't just about direct opportunities, but it's about supporting and diversifying the supply chain. So young business owners, women-led businesses, Black and BAMI-led businesses, LGBT plus business owners. We've noticed in our surveys that these are on the rise, and these are people going it alone, taking on huge risk. And it's those people who are going to change the face of business and change the world and benefit at the same time each local community. Now, I've looked at some of our exporters, and we've got a high-end stationery manufacturer from Bristol who exports to the US, a luxury homeware and scarves provider from Cardiff, a solar-powered phone charging street furniture supplier from Belfast who supplies to theme parks across the US, an architecture practice selling 3D designs and animations to US companies. So I think it's quite hard to come out with a policy that can serve all of this, but if we crack it, my God, the opportunity is enormous. Anthony referenced how this intertwines politically with the UK-EU Brexit debate. And I'd say, unlike larger organisations, small businesses were genuinely split down the middle on Brexit before the referendum. And since the moment, we've seen the benefits of pursuing an independent trade policy, and seeing this writ large properly in this set of trade deals is something we are keen to keep the focus on. Now, drawing down from Anthony's kind of helicopter stats across the top, for small business, the US is our members' #1 individual market. Just over half of our members who trade do so with the US. And we know that the opportunity here will be two-way trade already amounts to about $230 billion. We do lean in that towards goods rather than services at the small business end, and perhaps that's something we can talk about. But that our evidence predates the COVID crisis. It means that the innate desire, the innate drive to reach the US is there and can be discovered after the crisis. And as people around the world start to bounce back, I think we're starting now to talk about in the UK about a trade-led recovery. As the economy here in the UK is likely to struggle among the hardest in the world and come out last, that's really important that when we look at recovery that we tap into trade. If you've got growing economies elsewhere, it makes sense to do all we can to tap into those. So at the moment, a third of our economy, and in terms of the small business economy in the UK, a third of that is missing, it's shut down. Not necessarily forcibly by instruction, it's shut down, it's not there. The government's 4 major flagship schemes have kept us going. That's been the economic equivalent of life support. But that cannot continue forever. And our stats show that between 1 in 50 and 1 in 5 small businesses say they're not sure if they will ever reopen again. So that means we have to tap into that economic growth in other markets. And actually that could make the difference between a UK business surviving or not. So just turning to the US-UK deal in itself, the launch of these talks could not come at a better time. When it comes to the deal, we want to see that comprehensive small business chapter as part of the free trade agreement. And actually, we initially explored this with TTIP, you may remember, some years ago. But here in the US-UK trade deal, we're on the cusp of seeing the first ever small business chapter in a UK trade deal. This is so exciting. It is a major moment. It's not just going to be important for that trade between these two countries. It's also blazing the trail for all the future FTAs that are currently going along for the UK around the world. So I don't think the importance can be overstated. It's really pleasing to see the ambition and enthusiasm reflected from the UK government, from Department for Trade negotiators, hopefully after talking to us, but also from the US negotiators too, after we assume doing the same thing, speaking to the small business community over there. So to get calls for pro-small business measures in stereo is the ideal. And it also shows that I think we're going to see real progress over that over the next couple of weeks as the trade round continues. Now that moves pro-small business sentiment, which we all feel, I think, into policy. And that's a challenge that we're really focused on in this deal. So there are lots of issues where we want to see progress, digital trade, property rights, trade facilitation, the difficulties of keeping up with new legislation, mobility of professionals, tariffs, of course, and also things like the UK-US SME dialogue and how do you make a joint small business committee work under the deal. And I've got a colleague on the call, James Sibley, who's closest to this and may be able to take questions on those if we need to. But I just want to finish by saying, beyond the trade deal, we also have in the UK our place in the WTO. And so I wonder how we can explore how that will work. We're a medium-sized economy in a world dominated by 3 big trading blocs, the US, the EU, and China. And how will the UK use that to geopolitically to kind of leverage this? What can we do to boost global trade? So aside from the kind of politics swirling at the top, I think underneath that, there's quite a lot to talk about on the technical side, on the discussions going on about how we can work together, US and UK, to make that change. And as we look to the future, I know that 20% of our members exports, that's 1 in 5, but with the right support, we think we can raise that to 40%. That is the challenge for us, where the UK-US trade deal could help benefit that and help achieve that. It is inherently a good thing. Exporters enjoy higher turnovers, they employ more people, and they last longer. So this is about rules and help, but it's also about communications about this trade deal to make sure it's used by small businesses when it comes in. So I hope that's useful. I think that intersection of trade, the need for recovery, and the desire to look at the US market means we're up for a real exciting time, and we're ready to grab that. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Let me kick off some questions. I'll start with Anthony. Thanks for the overview of your government's views of how the negotiations should go. I did want to raise get your thoughts on 2 difficult policy issues that the governments are going to have to wrestle with. The first is digital service taxes, DSTs, which the US government, USTR, just launched a Section 301 investigation on such proposals by a number of countries, but including the United Kingdom. So would welcome any thoughts you have on whether there will be interaction in the FTA negotiations on that issue as well, and whether it's going to be just handled entirely outside. And then secondly, privacy. Privacy issues were, while the TTIP negotiations were going was a difficult issue that the EU and the US were grappling with. A post-EU UK, what will they have on privacy? Will it be GDPR? And if so, what does that mean for the US-UK FTA negotiations? So if you could give some thoughts on that, I think everyone would be very interested.
Sure, thanks very much. So digital services tax, I mean, yes, as you say, the USTR have just launched proceedings and sought consultations with us and others. I think I'd offer two comments, and to be clear, I mean, this is a matter really handled between our two treasuries, as well as on the trade side. The UK has been pushing for a while now for a conversation in the OECD about how we have a proper global level conversation about how we handle tax-related issues in the context of the digital economy. I think, grossly oversimplifying, I think our view is that the rules at the minute just aren't fit for purpose, and we are not able to address this issue in the way that we would want to. We pushed, as I say, we are pushing very hard for progress in the OECD, including with our US colleagues. But we are concerned that that process is not moving, and we don't think that we can just sit back and do nothing. So that's why the UK government, over a year ago now, came forward with its proposal for a UK digital services tax. We do not believe it is discriminatory. It's not targeted on any one country. And we believe it is a reasonable and proportionate approach to this issue. It does also not mean that we've given up on progress in the OECD. In fact, we would love to see this as a prompt for more progress in the OECD. So we will continue to discuss this with our US colleagues. In terms of the relationship with the FTA process, I'll be honest, I don't think there's necessarily a way of solving this within the FTA. I think it may well be part of the discussions within the FTA about digital trade overall. As I say, that's a big priority, I think, for both sides. I would concede openly that we have heard very clearly from some in Congress that if we still have a problem with a digital services tax that they perceive to be unfairly targeted on US companies, or as I say, we don't accept that. They have made clear that it will possibly affect the way they will vote on the FTA. So we certainly want to address and resolve the issue. And as I say, ideally, we'd like to resolve it in the OECD. So if we could have more engagement and participation in those discussions from all of our partners there, that would be a very good thing. On privacy, I mean, again, this I think is obviously one of the areas where we're negotiating in parallel on the EU track in terms of our future data relationship with them, as well as wanting to open up the opportunities with the US. I think we'll have to see how we sort of balance that. I think in the UK, we continue to have a very vibrant debate about the balance between openness and privacy. We obviously are part of GDPR at the minute, and we will have to see, as I say, what opportunities that provides for our relationship with the US. But again, at the heart of this, I think, is going back, I think, as I said, and then Laura, I think, really emphasized, how can we really use this conversation to establish how economies like the US and the UK, I would say right there at the top of the charts in terms of exploiting the opportunities of digital trade and needing to understand how data flows between us, how we can really set standards that sort of rise above sort of the bilateral piece of this and look to the global piece, so that companies can exploit all of the opportunities of the digital economy, while consumers and individuals in our societies have the necessary reassurance about the protection of their privacy. Thanks.
Fantastic, thanks. Laura, obviously, UPS is one of the most famous service companies in the world. So what opportunities do you see for the US and UK with respect to the negotiations on services and how the economies of both countries can be advanced through that?
So, just a couple of observations, and just on an overarching level, I see the UK-US agreement as an opportunity to make trade agreements fairer, juster, and more inclusive. And so, from that perspective, I think services plays a fundamental role in that, just because it covers the gamut of all the ways in which we can make an agreement stronger in all those areas. I see Mike Dolan's on, and he raised an excellent point about, our 495,000 employees, a big group of them are our Teamsters and our pilots and our machinists, all of whom keep our network running. And so, in that regard, the criticality of people in our network and our services is something that I think is going to be important in the context of the agreement. So it's not just about movement of people to be able to provide services, but also ensuring that our people, as part of our services network, have all the protections that they need. And so the UK-US agreement is an opportunity to kind of, use the same kind of model that was developed in the USMCA agreement to ensure that worker protections are there and solid and strong, because we could not have delivered had it not been for our people. Second, I would say, is the importance of ensuring that there is fairness. And with a lot of the services elements in the economy, think about financial services, think about technology services, think about transportation services. A lot of them have been impacted right now, particularly on the trade side. I think about all the passenger aircraft, for example, that have been grounded or operating at, a tenth of capacity. We have to make sure that in this agreement, that as services, the services parts of our economy are reopened, that they're reopened on the basis of a level playing field. And I think there's a real opportunity to really develop the disciplines within the UK-US agreement to address that fundamental question that wasn't ever addressed in any agreement, and that's services subsidies. We've already got great market access in terms of the UK and the US, in terms of market access and general national treatment for services, but it's the other, doing business issues related to those subsidy questions where I think we could really raise the bar. And last, I would say, is the e-commerce and digital trade elements of this agreement. When I think about the value chain for e-commerce, it includes so many important services sectors: financial services, distribution services, telecommunication services. Go across that value chain in order for it to serve the small and medium-sized businesses that are such important customers for UPS and that Craig so eloquently advocates for. We need to make sure that we've got the right modern rules in place, so especially the small and medium-sized businesses can take advantage of those opportunities that it creates. And I would say that's one of the best ways that we can make trade more inclusive. I think about, all the people, like I said, that have been affected by COVID-19. A lot of the women, the minority-owned businesses, the small businesses, they're the ones that have been affected the most in many respects by the downturn in economies, by the closure of or the shutdown of economies. Digital trade and e-commerce are a means to be able to tap a bigger customer pool from around the world. If we can write those tools, and those rules well, we open up a lot of more opportunities for those that haven't traditionally benefited as much as they should. And I'd be remiss, because everybody knows UPS, it's our favorite topic of all: make trade simpler, more efficient, easier to do. When you accomplish those objectives, more trade can happen. And where does the rubber hit the road, or the plane actually land? Right there at the border with the customs provisions. anything we can do to liberalize and strengthen and simplify those customs provisions, we're doing a great service in terms of addressing every single area of how to create a more fair, just, and inclusive trading environment. Because if you stop it at the border, you're not making anything happen. So you got to make those rules easier to follow for especially the small and medium-sized businesses. So those are the ways that I think it can be transformational.
Thanks very much, Laura, and I'm glad you mentioned the question from Mike Dolan. We definitely have an all-star cast of people asking Q's and A's. So let me ask a quick question to Craig, and then we can turn it over to Ken to start going through those Q's and A's. In fact, I'm going to steal one of those Q's and A's from Bernard Asher, who was wondering if Craig could just elaborate on the differences in trade benefits that might come from the agreement between small business and large business.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. It actually links somewhat to Laura's comments there as well. So if I'm thinking about on the service side of things, when we have looked at who has been most affected in terms of the sectors of the economy for small business here, one of the, obviously you've got hospitality at one end, which has been forcibly shut down, and then it kind of graduates all the way through. Well, one of the sectors that's doing relatively well at the moment is legal services and financial services and some of those professional sectors. So if there's a way, because those businesses are active and trying to find work, of connecting those through digital trade into these new markets, then this is an obvious, I think, element of the recovery plan. I also think there's something here on data. So a small business, when it first hits a customs form, is the moment when it goes, oh God, I need some help. So what we need to do, if there's a way of automating some of these processes through the agreement, a way of smoothing things through, about thinking, we actually have a similar phrase, the one that Laura used, which is to get policymakers to think small first. So if you're looking at that border and how it operates, don't think about necessarily about customs agents and processes and warehouses. It should think about, okay, what are we trying to get? How does a small business negotiate through that? How do you make it seamless, easy? Keep Trade Easy was one of our reports too. I hope Laura's read that. I think maybe that's where she's got it from. I don't know. But you know, if there's a way of tapping into a sector that wants to expand and getting through that trade barrier in the US, that would be absolutely enormous. And small businesses don't always think about trade at the very start of their journey. And I think there's an opportunity here in the trade-led recovery to do that.
Fantastic. Well, Ken, I don't know if you'd like to come in and relay some of the questions. As I mentioned, just scrolling through who's posing questions, it is really an all-star cast of folks that I recognize, from former USTR folks to unions, private sector, former WTO folks. So anyway, really looking forward to this part of it.
Thanks, Tim. You're absolutely right. I mentioned that we had a session yesterday with the Congresswoman. We had 21 questions come in overall. We've had 18 already posted in here. We're going to try to get to as many as we can. Going to probably have to combine some of them, but I think there 3 or 4 of them, all direct this towards Anthony, ask about the nexus between a negotiation with the US and the negotiations with the EU, and how you square that circle. And I'm going to layer on that includes both the substance of it and what the EU's expectations are, as well as what you're hearing from the US. Going to layer on a couple other questions that came into that, if you can keep track of that. Of course, the Irish border issue, how that gets resolved. There's a big impact, a lot of attention being paid in the US Congress about that, which has had a long history of having opinions about US Northern Ireland, US Irish relations. So all those different pieces, how they fit together. And a related question that's come in about agriculture. Again, it's a big issue for the US Congress. And it's something that with the regulatory and other issues also impacts on the EU-UK negotiations. So how do all those pieces fit together in your mind, if you can explain that very complicated puzzle in 2 or 3 minutes?
Great. Well, thank you very much. So 3 very, very quick thoughts, I think, to cover all of those in one.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, as I said earlier, we're conducting the negotiations between the UK and US, UK and the EU in parallel. Both of them have, I mean, the EU one has a fixed timetable. It will end by the end of this year when we leave the transition period, and we have made clear that we will not be extending it. There have been 4 rounds of negotiations, including last week was the most recent one. David Frost, who's our chief negotiator, I saw his comments to a committee in our House of Lords. I mean, he feels that he would like to have made more progress, but he still thinks that progress is being made. And I think that's what we're hearing from our EU colleagues as well. That doesn't sort of, again, I don't want to gloss the sort of the difficult issues sitting at the heart of it, including some of the issues around level playing field, fisheries, and things like that. I think the point I would make about the interrelationship is, our US colleagues, I think, and again, I don't want to speak for them, but they're very interested in what's happening on the EU track. I think both because they want to understand the dynamic between the 2 processes. And again, going back to the Trade and Investment Working Group I mentioned, the reason I used to attend that when I was in my previous role was in order to give them a sense of how these processes fitted together. I think there are some areas where we probably do need to have greater clarity about where we're going to end up on the EU track, but I think those are sort of, we can discuss those with our US colleagues and then they can drop into place later down the track. There are lots of areas, though, where we don't need to wait for that. We've just established our global tariff schedule, so we can have a discussion with the US colleagues about tariff issues. There are areas where we will set our own standards, including on issues like SPS, which takes us into the ag issues. I would be very honest. We have always known that agriculture is a key issue in any US FTA negotiation. And the line that I often quote is the line from Senator Grassley, where he said that agriculture is the locomotive that pulls along goods and services in any FTA discussion with Congress. So we know it matters. I would note, by the way, it also matters to us. We have some offensive interests in the ag space, in some of the sort of the tariff issues, access to US markets and things like cheese, lamb, and things like that. So, it's a sensitive topic, but it is a topic that I think there is a way of finding a mutual way forward that delivers opportunity to both sides, and that will be important. On the Irish border, again, we are absolutely on the same page as those in the US who have, again, I'll put this frankly, dedicated enormous amounts of time and money and commitment to the Northern Ireland peace process over the last few decades. It would not have happened without key interventions from key US players. We have no intention of allowing the UK-EU negotiations to disrupt the gains of the Northern Ireland peace process. That is clearly set out in the protocol and the withdrawal agreement in terms of ensuring that there is no disruption to the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And again, a little bit, like I said, on the digital services tax, there are key members of Congress who have made clear that what happens on that set of issues will have an impact on the way they will vote on an FTA, including people in very, very key positions on House Ways and Means. So again, we know that we need to put these pieces together in a way that protects the gains of the past, focuses on the opportunities of the future, but without doing consequential sort of, having consequences in other areas that will affect the way that people look at these issues. And I'm utterly confident that we can put them together as we go forward. Thanks.
Thanks. A lot to cover, and I'm probably going to have to come back to you, Anthony, for some more of the questions that have come in. I'm going to direct the next one to Craig, who's also welcome onto the line. You'll see on your screen James Sibley. James works with Craig at the Small Business Federation in the UK, and we're pleased to have you here. Help answer questions related to UK business and UK small business. One that comes in that I think I can point in your direction, if it's one that you're able to answer or speak to, is, and it goes to these trade negotiations. There's a longer history in the UK of government involvement in the economy, state-owned enterprises. I'm sure for your small businesses, that's an interesting issue for you, your companies or your individuals who own companies have to face. How do you see that playing into the trade negotiations, and what are the views of some of your members on some of those issues?
About state-owned enterprises. I mean, our community is 5.8 million small and micro enterprises. Most of them are about 4.8 million of them don't employ anyone else. So they're simply single people on their own, setting themselves up. It's very exciting. Off they go and trade. It's very fragile. It's very risky. I don't see that as something in terms of the day-to-day pressures on small businesses. I don't think they're thinking about that. And if you look at the numbers of the community, it has grown steadily. It's grown steadily for, I think, since about 1990. So we're on an upward trajectory. We had one blip. The one blip was in 2016 when it slightly went down, and that was mainly because of uncertainty. So what they need more than anything else is they do need to look at competition. They do need to see, who are they going to face if they enter a new market. But I think in terms of domestic economy, there's nothing on that front, I'd say. James, would you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'll add is that obviously we've seen a lot of quite substantial government support measures being brought in because of COVID-19, as we've seen across the world. But these are very much temporary. They're really just to get us through this immediate crisis. They're not for the long run. And I think our members and our small businesses in the UK are really keen to just get back to doing business and really engaging with that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that they have at their hearts. So I think with state-owned enterprises in the context of the trade discussions, I don't think that's a thing that small businesses are too concerned with. I think the main thing we have supported the existing kind of subsidy arrangements under the WTO. We don't want small businesses competing with major state-backed enterprises. I don't really foresee that being a major issue in the context of these talks, but we continue to monitor.
Thank you. Thanks. So next one, a question that comes in related to, the US and the UK have a long and deep history of trade. How do you see this, Laura, maybe this one coming to you with so much history yourself, negotiating trade as part when you were with the government and in the private sector, with so many different sectors that you've covered in your career, from banking to telecom to what you do now, which brings in so many different aspects of it. But how do you see the nexus between the US-UK negotiations, previous FTAs, our existing trade relationships, and maybe what are some of the landmines that we might face in these negotiations that could upset some existing trading relationships, like the DST one that maybe is one that's causing potentially new frictions?
So I will share with everyone, one of my favorite shows is The Big Bang Theory, and the character is Sheldon Cooper, and he always loves to play 4- and 5-dimensional chess. And I feel like that's what all of this is. It's so many different elements that have to come together. And sorry, Anthony, to put so much pressure on the UK on this one, but the reality is we have a tremendous opportunity to get a lot of things right, but you have to be purposeful and thinking about all these different intersections of trade opportunities with all of these different negotiations going on. And boy, if we get it right, we set the stage for stronger economic recovery and growth going forward. I think the ingredients are there in that, the UK and the EU had an existing and powerful, robust trading relationship. I would really hope, and obviously UPS is advocating for this, that the EU and the UK figure out to reestablish that as much as possible and build on that relationship that previously existed. Second, I'd say that the UK has a great opportunity right now. You're going to be establishing new customs processes, leapfrog, do it better than anyone else in the world, set that standard for some of the other agreements that you're negotiating, including with the United States. So yes, set your de minimis at $800, make your processes electronic, make it as easy as possible for those one-person small and medium-sized businesses to engage in trade, be it the UK with the EU or the UK with the US, or the UK companies or US companies with the rest of the world. I think that's a huge opportunity. I'd be remiss if I didn't point to the fact that look at all the social unrest that has happened. There was tremendous social unrest in Chile with concerns about globalization. There's unrest here in the United States. I think pent up frustration post-COVID-19, but a lot of inequities that have been built into our system on the social justice side. I would argue Brexit is an expression of a lot of those same kind of frustrations. So let's get it right. Let's figure out ways, to use the trade agreements to create more opportunities for everyone, because at the end of the day, we're all true believers on trade. We've just got to write the rules in the smart ways so that it can create and open up new opportunities for those that previously haven't. And I would say, look at the Northern Ireland border question. That agreement was foundational for creating that political stability that allowed for so much economic opportunity to be established. Let's figure out how to keep that seamless, and by the way, build on it, because we're seeing around the world a lot of political tensions. We're seeing a lot of calls to raise the barriers to trade for protectionist reasons. And there's a lot of politics driving that. We need to overcome those barriers and figure out how to create, that smooth, seamless trading system again that existed pre-COVID-19. And maybe UPS has a unique perspective on that, because as barriers were being put up and as borders were being shut down, UPS was allowed to keep moving across borders. And if we can get policymakers, not just in the UK and the US, to recognize the vital role that that movement across borders plays, and that kept as many people to be able to weather the pandemic as possible, let's return back to those systems. Here I'm thinking about all the amazing arrangements that the UK set up and the European member states set up with green lanes for moving goods across borders. There's a start to begin with. We can build that in. So let's make that, the platform for future FTAs as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. And I see Craig has unmuted his line and might want to jump in and add something here.
Yeah, I think that inspires me about something, actually. So we're a federated model. So we have FSB in Northern Ireland is very strong. What I've found extraordinary over the last 2 or 3 months is the development of a cross-business push on how the Northern Ireland Protocol can work. So it's been an incredibly uniting force across the border, with business groups in Ireland working very closely with business groups in Northern Ireland. And we all want to do the same thing. And I think the governments want to do the same thing. We're just kind of waiting for the negotiations to conclude before we can get there, even though the protocol, of course, is already in place. But the one thing that comes out of those remarks for me is about something that I'd call FOMO. So the one motivating factor for all small business owners is seeing what other small business owners do and succeed in. And I think organizations like FSB have a role to play in celebrating those who are already trading without a free trade agreement, that are already doing good stuff. And I think the Washington Trade Association has exactly the same kind of responsibility, as well as UPS within its supply chain. And if we can engage and excite people and not just focus on some of the negative aspects in the current trade negotiation conversation in the public, I think you'll get more trade as a result. And I think that's what we all want to see.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely, Craig. And that's a terrific sentiment. We're not going to close though on it, even though it's a good one. I do want to bring up a sticky wicket issue. We don't have a whole lot of time, but there is an ongoing trade dispute between the US and the EU. And when I say ongoing, I mean like 20 years ongoing. And that's Boeing Airbus. There are continued motions in that. It's not directly part of the US-UK negotiation, I don't believe, but it does have an impact because there are existing tariffs the US has on it. Maybe Tim, I know you follow this a little bit. If you can just kind of give a little background on where things are right now, what you think some of the expectations might be of the US, and Anthony, how that may play into the negotiations, even though that's a US-EU issue, UK is still part of that and there are existing tariffs in place.
Sure. Thanks again for the background for our participants. The U.S. has imposed WTO consistent or approved retaliation over subsidies that were given to Airbus. The EU still may do the same with respect. It's still a point of contention, but it's possible that the EU ends up imposing retaliation on the U.S. for subsidies that they've argued have been given to Boeing. And of course, the U.S. retaliation is both against EU products and in sometimes particular EU member states, including the UK. And so Be fascinated to hear what Anthony has to say about what happens in that context after the UK leaves the EU. Will that be addressed as well as a possibility as part of the FTA negotiations? Is that a goal of the United Kingdom?
And as someone who enjoys a glass of scotch, Anthony, I hope we can find a way out of this.
Here. So, I mean, as Tim mentions, I mean, there's a long backstory to this, with various cases taken by the EU against Boeing and by the US against Airbus. I think both sides have found themselves on the wrong side of WTO rulings on that, and both sides have sought to respond. The UK, our contention is that we have addressed previous subsidies, and we are disappointed in the WTO ruling that says that we haven't. And I think the other comment I'd make, and again, hugely complicated set of issues, but there's Boeing and Airbus are hugely important companies in both economic jurisdictions. I think we have an opportunity, it seems to me, to try and find a way forward where we can work out how we are going to address these issues between us. There is a reality, it seems to us, which is that if we spend too much time sort of chucking WTO cases and tariffs at each other, then we will find that someone else is sort of coming up on the rails, and I don't think that's in our interest. So I think we would very much like to see a resumption of a discussion between the EU and US, or continuation of discussions between EU and US to resolve these issues for the long term. We certainly regret the impact on our exporting sectors who have nothing to do with the Boeing Airbus case, including, as you mentioned, Scotch whisky. It's of course not the only area where we're applying tariffs to each other, which I think, again, we think it would be better if we weren't. We are still subject to US tariffs on steel and aluminium. We are still applying EU retaliatory tariffs as a result of that. We would love to find our way in a more constructive position where the US and the EU, the UK and the US, the UK and the EU in the future, that sort of triangle, working together to address some of these big challenges in the global economy, because they're not going away anytime soon. And everything that we've touched on that we want to achieve in the UK-US FTA and take it into the global context, it's the UK and the US and the EU, the UK and Canada as well, actually, from my sort of broader perspective, working together to set these rules. And if I may, just to come back on something that Laura said that I think is really, really important. The Prime Minister, even before the COVID crisis, was very committed to what he calls levelling up, delivering jobs, growth and economic opportunity to all parts of the United Kingdom, in the same way that we feel that an FTA can deliver jobs, growth and opportunity to all parts of the United States. But as we come out of the COVID crisis and deal with the impact and the varying degrees of impact on different parts of our country, different parts of our society, the other phrase the Prime Minister uses there is that we need to build back better. We need to come back stronger. We need to have more resilience in our supply chains. And there's some big conversations to be had together on that as well. So again, let's have those conversations together. We haven't touched in this conversation, but another priority for the UK government is we want to build back greener. We need to create a more sustainable economy. We have an ambition to meet net zero. We will chair the COP26 meeting next year. That's an absolute priority, but it's about creating economic growth in a way that is sustainable, resilient, and green, and that delivers, as I say, opportunity for our people for the future. Thanks.
Well, thank you all. I need to issue a blanket apology to the nearly a dozen questions we haven't had time to get to on today's session. But our panelists are all very busy, have a lot of things that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and I can't keep them on the line forever. So thank you all. Apologies we didn't get to things like chlorinated chicken and Huawei and 5G and all the other things that have been raised in the questions. I apologize to all of them, but I thank all of you. Thank you, Craig and James. Thank you, Laura. Anthony, it's a pleasure to see you again. And Tim, thank you for your help in moderating today's session. Really appreciate it. We hope maybe, Anthony, we can have you back in a few months to report on some progress on the negotiations. We'll be continuing these sessions through the summer online. And while we are certainly hoping to get back to be able to see people in person, we're glad to be able to bring people in diverse geographies together, across time zones and geographies. to meet together with the WITA community. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Really appreciate having you here, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.